To begin with, we will look at what a learning situation entails when it comes to reading and writing for our disciplines. What we usually take for granted and focus on when we prepare for class or when we design a course is the core of what makes for learning, which is the knowledge or the skill that we want to convey. That is what we talked about in the first module when we referred to the what. We've already covered the part that deals with identifying what is useful for our students, but we need to realize that this is not all that goes into teaching someone how to read and write or into their process of learning how to read and write. The very content of this knowledge is specific and needs to be thought of separately. Things like rhetorical modes of writing, things like what makes for good descriptive writing, good analytical writing, what is a critique, and how each of these might actually look different in the process of putting it down on the page is something that the student needs to know, needs to think about, and to be able to apply, make it into a skill that they can practice. And therefore, the tutor also needs to be very familiar with these. And this is something that we will cover in later modules. Along with this, the area of knowledge that goes into the making of the learning situation also entails being very aware of what we call the genre agnostic mechanics of writing. These are things like how a text ought to be structured, whether it is short or long, and whether there are differences among these. Things like brevity, things like appropriateness in the language we use and the vocabulary, they cut across genres. They're not specific to one of them, but they are aspects of writing that we as tutors look at irrespective of what we are teaching or what we're asking our students to learn. And there are also aspects that we want our students to take from one piece of writing and transfer to everything else that they're working on. Also, here are genre conventions and requirements. We've already talked about how important it is to define very clearly what we're asking our students to write. That means that we should be aware of what it means to write a manifesto versus what it means to write a standpoint piece versus what it means to write an opinion piece for a newspaper. Aspects connected to genre conventions are again going to be covered in later modules, where each one of you will have an opportunity to select what is relevant for you. And along with all of this, knowledge entails being aware of what is a well written text in each of these. It is not just the theoretical conventions that we are concerned with, but it's also the experience of having looked at, having come across texts which are well done, which communicate following the genre conventions or even breaking them, and being able to identify when these decisions work well for the reader. If this is everything that goes into the knowledge that we want to have exchanged within the process of learning and teaching, obviously, there are things like assumptions that we make all the time, assumptions about lower and higher order knowledge and skills and how these are communicated, as well as assumptions about transfer of knowledge. This is what we were just talking about, the fact that I would like to think that my students, having once written an introduction, will be able to write a good introduction for every other text they write across their learning journey and also across their careers. But is this assumption justified? That is another aspect connected to the knowledge that we want to convey, which needs to be interrogated and which needs to be used strategically. And if we have the knowledge part of the learning situation covered, we need to come to an aspect that we don't often reflect on enough, which is the learner. The learner is not the same everywhere, is not a static piece of the puzzle. In fact, for most of history, the learner was taken to be an empty vessel who comes to us knowing nothing at all and who is to be filled by the knowledge that we as tutors possess. It's been several decades, in fact, more than four, since Paulo Freire actually looked at this assumption and challenged it and brought in the relevance of the kind of knowledge exchange and knowledge transmission that takes place in every learning situation. So, this is the basic that we need to consider as tutors. And while Freire was talking about it in the context of knowledge outside of the domain of reading and writing, there have been innumerable studies that are looking at the kind of knowledge about reading, the kind of knowledge about writing that each one of our students has and brings to the classroom, which is knowledge that we should not disregard. It's knowledge on which we can continue to build. So, when it comes to the learner, we need to be aware of their already existing knowledge and skills, but we also have to be aware of the fact that they come with a certain motivation, which they might have or might not, that they come with a sense of self efficacy, that they come with their own background, with their own personhood. And these are aspects which determine the way in which they interact with the knowledge and skills that we are introducing them to. The link between the learner and the knowledge and skills is made by the various ways in which people learn. And this is again a huge domain of expertise, a disciplinary domain of its own from which we need to draw. There are ways in which thinking and conceptualizing reading and writing takes place in our brains. There are ways in which motivation determines whether we're able to engage with this knowledge and skills, and these have to be taken into account as we design the learning situation for us and for the learners. And let us not forget, we're not teaching one person at a time. We're constantly working in a context where we have multiple learners, which means that they bring variety, diversity, they bring different levels of motivation and self efficacy. And plus, we also know how easy it is for an entire classroom to get out of hand because a bunch of people have started talking or have started feeling demotivated, and all of a sudden, all our plans have gone to the dogs. And because we've been talking about us, let's remember that what makes the learning situation is also the teacher or the tutor, that's us ourselves. And the most instinctive thing to think of is the domain knowledge or the expertise. For most of us, this domain knowledge is not to do with reading and writing. We have a lot of experience, we bring a lot when it comes to architecture or design or any of the built environment disciplines, but we need to build as much domain knowledge when it comes to reading and writing in itself. Along with this, we're bringing with us our own assumptions about learning. The way in which most of us teach comes from the way in which we learn. What comes naturally to us, if it is not questioned, if it is not established as an assumption, gets turned into our own assumption about our learners. So, this is a contribution that can be productive, but it's also an instinct that we have and that needs to be challenged and broadened so that we know how to use it productively. The hidden assumptions about learning make the connection between us and the knowledge and skills that we want to impart because these translate into the ways in which we're trying to communicate this knowledge and skills. It could be something as simple as choosing lecturing over a dialogue because of our own comfort levels or because of what works for us. Or it could be something about how we look at the writing that each student is producing and whether we choose encouragement or we choose a certain level of threat or we choose to point out what's going wrong as compared to what is going wrong, right. These are, again, just like the ways in which learning occurs, they are an entire body of knowledge that people have worked on, studies that have been done, and we need to be aware of in order to decide strategically at each point in the classroom, at each point in the writing journey, what makes most sense and what should be brought in. Along with this, we have more complex things that make us as people, our own background, our own politics, what reading and writing means as part of those, why we feel it's important for our students to know how to do them, but also our own relationship with our students when the background that we come from matches. When, for instance, we move in the same social circle, so we have a common language that the students and us can draw on, or when these social circles might be very different. And so our ability to understand their motivation, our ability to understand their aspirations differ. And we also have, let's be honest, the past trauma about learning and about teaching that we bring to every classroom, the difficulties that we know which come from maybe having had a bad class and then we don't really want to go face the same bunch of people all over again, or perhaps the joy that we've had learning a certain kind of writing and the joy that we then want to communicate to our students. We have our own individual and personal needs, which are valid and which need to be fulfilled. We want our students to look at us and to indicate to us that we have something to bring to their learning processes. We want our students to admire our expertise. But what happens when that need for admiration takes over the need to communicate clearly and at the level of our students? That is something that we need to keep in mind. So the learning situation is not as simple as we might think it is. It's not just knowledge, but it's all these very things that we've been talking about. And to make things even more complicated, it is also a question of all the effective relationships that we build among us in personal interaction, in the very physical space in which our class is taking place, in whether there is a dog coming into the classroom or not, in whether the space feels safe for whatever the reasons might be. This is all it takes, and this is all we need to think about one by one and together in order to design a learning situation that leads to the kind of outcomes and outputs we want to achieve. And now we will look at each one of these one by one.